Well, good afternoon, brethren, and happy high Sabbath to you all. It's great to be back up here again with you after my last opportunity to speak here a few months ago. My message today, we're going to look at one of the greatest leaders in the Bible who, with the help and power of God, led Israel out of Egypt. And today we're going to look at the life of Moses, who was the judge and a prophet of the newborn nation of Israel. Now, Moses was God's chosen instrument to help deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, he lived to a ripe old age of 120 years old. And his life can be broken up into three stages, which we'll look at and draw some practical lessons from. Now, the first stage of Moses' life was his early years as an adopted prince of Egypt, after he was spared from the decree for all the Israelite male babies to be killed. Now, the second stage of Moses' life began at age 40, according to Stephen in Acts chapter 7, after he fled to the land of Midian following an incident where he struck an Egyptian dead for mistreating an Israelite, and he would be there for 40 years. Now, the third and last stage of his life began with God calling him to go back to Egypt and to deliver Israel with God's help. Now, after Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites, God brought 10 great plagues upon Egypt, leading to Pharaoh relenting and Israel's exodus from Egypt. Now, after that would come the dramatic Red Sea crossing, the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, and the 40 years of wandering that God decreed because of Israel's sin. Now, since Moses died at age 120, some 40 years after the Exodus, this means that Moses was 80 years old when he led them out of Egypt. Now, it's interesting that each stage of his life is 40 years long, which is a biblically significant number related to trial and to testing. Now, today in part one of Lessons from Moses, we're going to look at the historical background of the Exodus and the events in the book of Exodus just prior to the birth of Moses. Now, I plan to cover the life of Moses in parts 2 and 3 of Lessons from Moses and the Exodus. Now, I've given you a handout covering the correct archaeological place and time for the Exodus. Now, when I do part 2, I'll have another on Moses with key data, the lessons from his life, as well as maps and other data. Now, most people's perception of Moses has in large part been based on the way that Moses is portrayed by Charlton Heston and Cecil B. DeMille's all-time classic movie, The 10 Commandments. Now, there are a number of myths and misunderstandings about the Exodus and the life of Moses, some of which come from that classic movie, as well as other places. So as we carefully analyse Moses and the Exodus from the Bible, we're going to dispel a number of myths and misunderstandings along the way. Now, in his book, The Authority of the Bible, Colin Peckham describes how many of the events in the Old Testament were types and shadows of events in the New Testament. Now, in relation to the Exodus and conquest, he writes, the history of the Israelites pictures the New Testament plan of salvation, showing that the Old Testament and the New Testament present one message. In the Old Testament, it is the shadows and types, and in the New Testament, we have the reality of an accomplished salvation. The Israelites were admonished to the Egyptians. Egypt is a picture of the old life of sin in which we are all held under the domination of Pharaoh, who represents the devil. Now, they were to be spared from the judgment of God, which rested on the whole land, only by applying the blood to their doorposts. The slain lamb is the substitute for the firstborn, and God's lamb is our substitute. Now, their eventful journey from Egypt had one objective, to bring them to Canaan. As many able commentators have affirmed, the picture of Canaan is that of the life of Christian victory. Now, before I cover the story of Moses, straight off the bat, I want to cover some important historical background about the Exodus, as many scholars have rejected the Bible's claim that the Exodus is a real historical event. Now, when it comes to matching what the Bible says happened and what archaeology has found, there is usually excellent agreement between the Bible and archaeology back to about 750 BC, at the time of the dominance of the Assyrian Empire. But before then, while some general things match, there seem to be these great mismatches between the Bible and archaeology. Not only is there no evidence of certain Bible events according to archaeologists, but the evidence seems to say the opposite of what the Bible says. For example, using the standard chronology of Egypt, there is no evidence for the mighty empire of King Solomon in the early Iron Age, as well as a complete mismatch between the biblical account of the Exodus and the Conquest and the archaeology of the late Bronze Age, where the standard chronology places both the early and late dates proposed by scholars for the Exodus. Now, following Kathleen Kenyon's excavations at Jericho, when she was unable to find any late Bronze Age city at Jericho to have conquered, a massive wave of scepticism about the historical accuracy of the Bible swept through Western academia. And these apparent mismatches have been seized upon by critics of the Bible to greatly discredit the Bible. Now, when Jesus said that we are to love God with all our heart, mind and soul, the use of the word mind here implies that our faith in God and His Word is not to be a blind faith where we believe without evidence, or worse, believe when the evidence contradicts what we have faith in. Now, given the excellent agreement between the Bible and archaeology back to around 750 BC, why then do we find such great mismatches between the Bible and the archaeology before that time? Now, this problem strikes at the very historical authenticity of the Bible. Can the Bible be relied upon or not? What changes before 750 BC, where we go from excellent agreement to poor agreement between the Bible and archaeology? Now, is the problem with the Bible crossing from history back to made-up mythology, as essentially proposed by archaeologist Israel Finkelstein? Or is the problem with the interpretations of archaeology and the chronology that's being used to date the evidence that archaeology has discovered? So if we were to accept the standard chronology of Egypt, there is a vexing problem that it presents for Bible scholars. Now, according to the standard chronology of Egypt, the place in archaeological history where we would expect to find evidence supporting the evidence, one of the greatest events in the Bible, is showing no evidence whatsoever that such an event took place. Now, there are two dates that are normally put forward by biblical scholars for the Exodus. Now, we read in Exodus 6, verse 1, that the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon's temple was built, which gives us a biblical date of around 1450 BC. Now, this date falls in the middle of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, according to Egyptologists. Now, in Exodus 1, verse 11, it says that the Israelites built these store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Now, the city of Pi-Ramesses in the Delta is usually associated with this city of Ramesses. Now, since this city was built during the reign of Ramses the Great, many Bible scholars place the Exodus at a later date of around 1250 BC, during the 19th dynasty, when Ramses the Great reigned according to the standard chronology. Now, according to Egyptology, both of these dates fall in the middle of the period that they call the Late Bronze Age. Now, this term, the Late Bronze Age, is a term that archaeologists use for the period of time that is contemporary with Egypt's two mightiest dynasties, Dynasty 18 and Dynasty 19. Now these are the two dynasties when Egypt's two most well-known pharaohs, King Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great, ruled Egypt. Now before those two dynasties was the time period that archaeologists call the Middle Bronze Age. And after those two dynasties is the next period of time that they refer to as the Iron Age. So please bear into your mind that the usual place that archaeologists place the Exodus is the Late Bronze Age. As we've seen, the Late Bronze Age is the time of Egypt's two mightiest dynasties, Dynasty 18 and Dynasty 19. Now let's go through the list of problems trying to place the Exodus during either the 18th or the 19th dynasty. Now the biggest problem in Egypt is that during the 18th dynasty, we have no great catastrophe recorded in Egypt matching the plagues of Egypt. In fact, we actually have the complete opposite. There was great prosperity, and the Egyptian kingdom expanded to its greatest size. Now, the 1450 BC date for the Exodus falls during the reign of a pharaoh called Thutmose III, who conquered all the way up to the river Euphrates. Now, many Christian scholars place the Exodus during the reign of his successor, Amenhotep II. But again, we find no great catastrophe and great prosperity and expansion during his reign and the other 18th dynasty kings that followed him. Now we have exactly the same problem with the time of Ramses the Great in the 19th dynasty, with no great catastrophe, and he too expanded Egypt's empire into Canaan and Syria. So during both of these dynasties, which are two of the best documented dynasties, Egypt was at her peak. She was very prosperous, and she expanded all the way into Canaan and Syria. Now this is completely different to the state of Egypt at the time of the Exodus, when Egypt, according to the Bible, suffered a gigantic catastrophe. Now we also have documented evidence from Egypt pointing to Israel already being a nation in the land of Canaan during these two dynasties. Now the Berlin pedestal, based on its writing style, has been dated to around the middle of the 18th dynasty. Now we've got three name rings of peoples who were conquered: Ashkelon, Canaan, and Israel. Now this evidence shows that Israel was already formed as a nation in the land when this was carved. Now in order for Thutmose III or his successor, Amenhotep II, to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, this inscription would have to be carved at least 50 years before their reign. Now the evidence of this Merlin pedestal on its own appears to rule out a 19th dynasty Exodus. Now another stela compounds the problem even further for the 19th dynasty. Now Ramses the Great's successor was known as Merneptah. Now there's a stela called the Merneptah, or Israel stela, from the time of this pharaoh, and it reads, "Israel is desolated, his seed is no more." Again, this argues for an Israelite presence in Canaan as a fully formed nation earlier than the time of Ramses the Great. Now another problem that we have is that we have all the mummies of the pharaohs from the 18th and the 19th dynasties, including our three main keynotes shown here, proposed as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Yet the Bible is clear that the pharaoh of the Exodus drowned in the Red Sea. Now Exodus 14:28 says, "All the army that went in, not one of them survived." And that's repeated in Psalm 96. Now Exodus 15:19 says that the horse of Pharaoh went in, according to the King James Version. And we've got an even more clear verse in Psalm 36 at the bottom here, which says that God overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. Now these verses put together leave little room for the view that any Egyptian Not even the Pharaoh himself survived the Red Sea crossing, despite the fact that Brunner made back to Egypt in the 10 months. Now, the only reason we see Brunner making back to Egypt in the 10 Commandments is because Cecil B. Mill knew that we had the mummy of Ramses the Great. Now, supporting those Bible verses, Josephus, in his account of the parting of the Red Sea, wrote the following: "And thus did all these men perish, so that there was not left one man as a messenger of this calamity to the rest of the Egyptians." Now, he was certainly of the opinion that the Pharaoh did not survive. Now, notice what the consensus is amongst the secular historians of this world regarding the historical accuracy of the conquest of Palestine by the Israelites. I quote: "The prevailing scholarly view is that the book of Joshua is not a factual account of historical events. The apparent setting of Joshua is the 13th century BCE, a time of widespread city destruction. But, with a few exceptions, Hatzor, Lachish, the destroyed cities are not the ones the Bible associates with Joshua, and the ones that it does associate with him show little or no sign of even being occupied at the time." According to archaeologist Andy Kilburn, most scholars today accept that the majority of the conquest narratives in the book of Joshua are devoid of historical reality. End of quote. So we see the situation in Palestine is just as bad if we try and place the conquest during the time of either the 18th or the 19th dynasties. There is no widespread destruction throughout the land of Canaan during the 18th dynasty, despite threats from bandits known as the IPUWER, who also threatened areas way north of where the Israelites conquered the land. Now, there were, however, a number of cities that were destroyed in Palestine near the end of the 19th dynasty, according to archaeologists. Now, the destroyed cities, however, as noted before, are not the ones the Bible associates with Joshua's conquest. In fact, according to the archaeology, most of the cities Joshua conquered were not even inhabited during the late Bronze Age, including its most famous city, Jericho. Now, in an article that appeared in the SIS Review called "A Chart to Illustrate the Conquest of Canaan" by John Gimston, he created this chart here to compare the archaeological finds for both the late Bronze and the Middle Bronze Age of the major cities mentioned in the conquest by Joshua. Now, notice the lack of matches with Joshua's conquest as described in the Bible in the left-hand column, placing the conquest during the late Bronze Age. And also now notice, on the other hand, the number of matches that we get with the earlier period known as the Middle Bronze Age in the right-hand column. So in a nutshell, the two big problems that archaeologists have with believing the Bible's account of the Exodus using either of the 2 dates put forward during the 18th or 19th dynasties are: 1, both of the 18th and 19th dynasties are very well documented, and there's not a single hint of any great catastrophe impacting Egypt at the time. And 2, most of the cities that the Bible tells us were conquered by the Israelites were not occupied during the late Bronze Age, such as Jericho. Now, there are 4 different approaches to this problem of trying to match the archaeological record with the biblical account of the Exodus and conquest. Now, the first is the view of most secular archaeologists, such as Israel Finkelstein and William Deaver. And they believe that because of the great inconsistencies between the late Bronze Age archaeology and the biblical account, that the stories of the Exodus and the conquest can be written off as having no historical basis whatsoever. Now, the second approach is the view that the standard chronology is correct and the Bible is only partly true and partly false. Now, this is the view of liberal Bible scholars and archaeologists such as William Albright and Kenneth Kitchen. Now, the dominant view amongst these is that the Exodus took place during the 19th dynasty around 1250 BC, because the archaeology shows that there was some semblance of widespread destruction in Canaan, unlike the earlier 18th dynasty. But however, this later date they use conflicts with much of the chronological data in the Bible and shortens the time for the time of the Judges to half of what the Bible says. Now, the third approach to the problem is that the standard chronology of Egypt is correct and the Bible is also true. Now, this is the approach taken by the Associates of Biblical Research, such as archaeologists Brian Wood and Scott Stribley. Now, as we've seen, this approach has some very serious challenges to overcome. Now, they do try and redate the pottery in Canaan to try and reconcile this problem, but redating the pottery only solves the problems at the Palestine end, and it doesn't deal with the other problems that we find in Egypt. Now, unless we're missing some key pieces of the puzzle, there seems to be too much of a mismatch to claim that both the Bible and the standard chronology are without fault. Now, if that is true, there's something that has to give. Either the Bible is at fault, or the standard chronology of Egypt is at fault. Now, the final approach to the Exodus problem is that the Bible is true and that it is the standard chronology which is faulty. Now, this is the view of chronological revisionists such as Emmanuel Valkowski, David Roll, John Benson, amongst others. So we saw before how there was an excellent match between Joshua's conquest and the cities destroyed in Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, can we find evidence in Egypt that also points towards the Middle Bronze Age being a better match for the Exodus? Now, it just happens that underneath that 19th dynasty city of PAPYRUS, archaeologist Manfred Bitak uncovered an old city which Bitak was able to identify as the ancient city of PHARAOHS in the eastern Delta where the Israelites were. Now, the archaeology of PAPYRUS spans two periods of time. Now, the older level showed it was dated to the time of the Middle Kingdom. Now, apart from a royal precinct, the site was predominantly settled by Semites from Asia. Now, the Semites of the early period were prosperous to begin with, but it seems apparent from the archaeology that towards the latter part of their time there, that they became impoverished, just as we see with the Israelites in Egypt. Now, after these Semitics left the site, it was then occupied by the Hyksos, who were foreign invaders who came in from the east. Now, PAPYRUS was populated by about 30,000 people. Now, John Gibson notes that there's evidence of many more of these Asiatic sites nearby, at least 20 or 30 of them, which haven't been excavated to any great scale so far. So it seems quite likely that when the Bible in Exodus 1:11 speaks of Ramesses as one of the cities built by the Israelites, that a later editor of the Old Testament, such as Ezra for example, updated the older name from PAPYRUS to the newer name of Ramses that was more familiar to the readers of his day. I'll give you an example of another such example. In Genesis 14, we read about Abraham pursuing the 5 kings up to Dan, long before the tribe of Dan had ever conquered that city and gave it that name. Now, there's much evidence arguing that the dating of when Egypt's pharaohs rule has been greatly overextended, and that many of the dynasties reigned later than the standard BC dates that are assigned to them. Now, David Roll, who is a trained archaeologist and is, ironically, an agnostic, has argued that Egypt's timeline has been overexpanded by a few hundred years. Now, he dates the Exodus not during the late Bronze Age, but during the Middle Bronze Age. And he places it at the time of the catastrophe that occurred during Dynasty 13 at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Now, he's featured in Tim Mahoney's excellent documentary, which I very highly recommend, called Patterns of Exodus. Now, in that documentary, David Ross says the following: "You look for a collapse in Egypt's civilization, and that is where you'll find Moses and the Exodus." Now, with that in mind, here is the document called the IPUWER Papyrus, which currently is housed in a museum in Leiden in Holland. Now, John Wilson, in his book The Additions of IPUWER, based on its language and orthography, dates this document to the 13th dynasty during the Middle Kingdom in the Bronze Age. Now, those who have looked at this document, some claim that this is a record of the Egyptians of the 10 plagues of Egypt, which it bears the most eerie resemblance to. Now, some of its passages read as follows: "Plague stalks through the land, blood is everywhere. Nay, but the river is blood. Trees are destroyed, no fruit or herbs are found. Gates, columns are consumed by fire. The land is not light. He who places his brother on the ground is everywhere. People are stripped of clothes. Their slaves takes what he can find. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli and turquoise are strung on the neck of female slaves. The stranger people from without are come into Egypt." Now, when I was in Holland, I went to see with my late friend Gary Michelson. Now, there was a Dutch translation to the side of it, so I took a photo of the translation in Dutch. And without telling her where it came from, I later asked Gary's girlfriend at the time, Marion, to translate it for me from Dutch to English and tell me what she thought it was. And I say I was very gratified when she said it sounds just like the plagues of Egypt. Now, one critic of this document, being a true historical record, stated that it was fictional because it was contradictory, giving the example that in one place it says the whole land is in great want, while at the same time female slaves become rich. Ironically, this specific detail is one of the best proofs linking with the time of the Exodus, as the Bible tells us that just before the last plague, the Israelites took their spoil from the Egyptians before leaving Egypt. The Egyptian priest Nephthah recorded that in the reign of a 13th dynasty king that God smote the Egyptians, and foreigners called the Hyksos took over Egypt for a long time, who invaded the country without difficulty or even a battle. Now, if the Exodus was a real historical event, it would be no surprise that a foreign power would seek to conquer Egypt and take advantage of the destruction caused by the 10 plagues, and the fact that Pharaoh and his entire army were all drowned in the Red Sea. Now, as we saw before, if we compare the archaeology of the Middle Bronze Age with the biblical account of the conquest, we get a perfect match. Now, all the sites Joshua conquered had destruction plans during the latter part of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, while Kathleen Kenyon did not find evidence for a late Bronze Age city of Jericho, she certainly found it near the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, right across the city, they found full storage jars in the Middle Bronze Age destruction layer. This tells us three things. Firstly, it indicates a quick attack, not a long siege, which is unusual given its double walls that it had. Second, it was near harvest time, and the Bible places it at the time of the barley harvest when the Passover is kept. Now, analysis of the grain showed it was actually barley. And thirdly, it was not spoiled by its attackers, which again agrees with the biblical account in Joshua 6. Now, there is much evidence for a collapse of civilization in Egypt at the time of the Middle Kingdom. Those Semitic people prior to them dwelt in the Nile Delta, as evidenced at PAPYRUS, who were rich to begin with, then became impoverished before they departed Egypt after a great catastrophe. Now, soon after that, during the Middle Bronze Age, there is destruction right across Palestine of a great many walled cities, including virtually all ones noted in So by placing the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom, near the end of the Middle Bronze Age, the correct timing is restored for the conquest of the land of Canaan, as demanded by archaeology, which records the destruction of cities all across Palestine at that time. Now, this excellent match during the Middle Bronze Age in both Egypt and Canaan shows that the Exodus really indeed was a true and real historical event. So, in summary, trying to reconcile the Exodus and conquest with the archaeology of the late Bronze Age could be likened to trying to place a square peg into a round hole. The round hole is the scriptural account of the Exodus account, and the square peg is the archaeology in Egypt and Israel for the late Bronze Age. As we have seen, we do, however, have a round peg that will fit perfectly into the round hole, and that is the archaeology in Egypt and Israel for the Middle Bronze Age. Now, how long was Israel in slavery in Egypt for? Now, there has been a rather persistent myth that has continued to be perpetuated that the slavery of the Israelites lasted some 400 years. Now, this is a misunderstanding of Exodus 12, verse 40, that says that the sojourning of Israel was 430 years. Now, notice carefully the word sojourning, not the word slavery. Now, the Apostle Paul in Galatians 3, verses 16 and 17, says that from Abraham, when the promises were made, till Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, was that same period of time, 430 years. Now, Josephus further clarifies this 430 years when he wrote, "They left Egypt in the month of Xanthicus on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came to Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob had removed into Egypt." Now, that figure of 215 years from Abraham moving to Canaan to Jacob moving to Egypt is correct, as it is a composite of three numbers. Now, the first is 25 years, which is the difference between Abraham moving to Canaan at age 75 till Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Now, next we add how old Isaac was when Jacob was born, which was 60 years. And then we add Jacob's age of 130 years when he moved to Egypt. Now, from that second block of 215 years, we have to subtract the remaining 71 years of Joseph's life after his father moved to Egypt, as the slavery did not begin until after Joseph died at age 110. And we know that Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, and he was born into slavery. So that means the slavery was somewhere between 80 years minimum and 144 years maximum. So based on that, the slavery of Israel was probably only around about 100 years old long. Now, the book of Exodus opens up with the names of the sons of Jacob, and then verse 5 says, "All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, but Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." So we see in Exodus at the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Genesis 15 that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand of the seashore, which is emphasised in Exodus 1:7 by the use of 5 different descriptions. They were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, waxed exceedingly, and the land was filled with them. Now, it seems that God was very much behind this population explosion of the children of Israel to fulfill his promise to Abraham. Now, we're told in Exodus 12:37 that the number of Israelites who left Egypt were 600,000 men, approximately. Now, when the first census was taken a year later in Numbers 1, we're told in verse 46 that the number of men 20 years and over who could go to war was 603,550. Now, based on that number of men, if we added women and children, we're probably looking at a number of around 2 to 3 million Israelites. That is a mind-blowing number of people to grow to in a little over 200 years since Jacob moved to Egypt. Now, the city of Brisbane has a population of 2 million people, so the Exodus, according to the biblical account, would be the equivalent of moving the entire population of Brisbane. Now, is that really possible? Was the number of Israelites exaggerated by Moses, as many people claim, or is it wrongly interpreted due to a false understanding of the original language? Now, Numbers 1 during the first census, a year after they left Egypt, all the numbers from each tribe are listed along with the grand total, which we saw before was 603,550 men. Now, in order to scale back what seems a possibly large number, many scholars interpret the Hebrew word for 1,000, the word Elef, to mean a clan. Now, those who interpret Elef this way say there are only about 20,000 Israelites. Now, is it true that the word, it is true that the word Elef can mean both 1,000 and also chief or clan. So is clan or unit the correct interpretation? Let's look at the totals for the clans and the number of people at the first census if we translate Elef as clan compared to its normal meaning of 1,000. And when you add up the tribe numbers using clans for Elef, you get 598, not 603 Elefs, as stated in Numbers 146. On the other hand, when you add up the number of the tribe numbers using 1,000 for Elef, they are perfectly to 603,550, as stated at the end of the census. Now, some critics might say that the grand total for the census was a later addition to the text that incorrectly used the wrong translation. Now, according to Exodus 30, verse 13, when a census or poll was done, all the men were to give half a shekel to the sanctuary. Now, in Exodus 38, when such a poll tax was taken up, the amount of silver collected was 100 talents plus another 1775 shekels. Now, there are actually 3,000 shekels to a talent, so 100 talents is the equivalent of 300,000 shekels. Now, throw in that extra 1775 shekels, and you get a grand total of 301,775 shekels. Now, if we want to find out the number of half shekels on that, we simply double it. And we come up with that number of 603,550, which is the exact match for the number of men in the first census. And when we do that same comparison between Elef and 1,000 for the second census, we have exactly the same result. Now, according to the book of Exodus, Israel grew from 75 to over 2 million people if we factor in women and children in a mere 15 years. Now, is that even mathematically possible? Well, let's try and figure out approximately how many children each couple would have to have, on average, for Israel's population to grow to that number in only 215 years. In Genesis 46, we're given the numbers of those who went down to Egypt. Now, Jacob, of course, had 12 sons. Now, those 12 sons had another 53 sons between them. So that's an average of 4.5 sons. And if we had the same number of daughters, we get about 9 kids per couple. So just bear that in mind as we move on to the next slide. Now, in order to figure out just how many children each couple would need to have to reach a population between 2 and 3 million at that time, I've created a spreadsheet to calculate that number. So I've started with a total of 75, inclusive of Joseph's family, and I've used 9 generations of around 25 years each. Now, once we calculate the number of new kids and add that to the existing population, I then subtract the number of deaths. And for that figure, I approximate the total population 3 generations earlier. So let's start with 4 kids per couple. Now the number of kids per couple gives us, that number of kids of 4 per couple gives us 32,000 after 9 generations. Now 5 kids per couple takes the final total up to 213,000. Now it's just over 1 million with 6 kids per couple. Then almost 4 million with 7 kids per couple. And if we put in 6.5, we have a final total of about 2 million. So you can see that sort of amazing growth is actually quite feasible under the right conditions if the Israelites average between 6.5 and 7 kids per couple. Now, following the death of Moses, we read in Exodus 1, starting in verse 8. Now, there was a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigour. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage. So we see here the Egyptians are afraid of the Israelites, especially if they join their enemies and fight against them, so they decide to enslave them. Now Jacob and his family migrated to Egypt. They dwelt in the land of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. Now in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, the word Goshen in Genesis 45:10 is called the Egyptian term Gesem. And this word Gesem specifically referred to an area around a long, narrow former lake that branched off the Nile in a place that is today called Wadi Chuma, where there are quite a number of Semitic place names. Now, Donovan Hall, author of The Exodus Problem and its Ramifications, presents several lines of evidence arguing that there was a significant overlap between dynasties 12 and 13 of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Now, in one Egyptian king list called the Sophist list, we have a number of dynasty 12 kings, and then only 2 dynasty 13 kings before it then gives the names of the Hyksos kings who came after. Now this leads Clawell to argue that dynasty 13 was actually a secondary line of kings underneath dynasty 12 before that dynasty ends and those last 2 dynasty 13 kings reigned before the Exodus. Now this leads him to believe that dynasty 12's second pharaoh, Sesostris I, the happy-looking chap that we see here at the bottom left, was the Pharaoh of Joseph. Now he was followed by 2 more kings before Sesostris III reigned following the death of Moses. Now Sesostris believes that Clawell believes that Sesostris III was the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, and that his successor, Amenhotep III, was the Pharaoh who ordered the killing of the male maidens. Now here are statues of those 2 pharaohs that were responsible for the enslavement of the Israelites according to Donovan Clawell. Now to me they look rather grumpy and mean looking pharaohs, not unlike internet sensation Grumpy Cat. Now several of the Middle Kingdom pyramids were built near the Great Lake called the Fayum, and in the midst of those pyramids was a town called Kahun, which was a war facility where evidence was found that held many, many slaves. Now the inhabitants of Kahun were likely the labour force that were used to build some of the nearby Middle Kingdom pyramids. Now unlike the stone pyramids of the Old Kingdom, these were built with mud bricks laced with straw, the very same material the Israelites were using for building for the Egyptians, as noted in Exodus 5. Now Josephus notes one of the things that the Egyptians had the Israelites build were pyramids, so that likely was these Middle Kingdom pyramids. Now at some point after the Egyptians are enslaved comes a shocking decree which was likely in the reign of Amenhotep We see that the Pharaoh orders all his people who have slaves working for them to kill every male baby. Horrible. Now the Hebrew midwives bravely do all they can to save any male babies and try and help them, for which God commends them for. Now notice one of the names of these midwives. Her name is Shifra. Go back to that in a sec. Now one notable discovery of Manfred Bitek's team at PAPYRUS was that they found amongst the early Semite population an extremely high mortality rate of newborns. Now according to the report, when all the children's graves aged 10 years and younger were identified, it was found that nearly 50% died in the first 3 months of life. And when the graves of those who made it to adulthood were examined, it was seen that there were 60% females to 40% males. So the reduction appears to have been in the male side of the population. So could this massive increase in infant burials at PAPYRUS be evidence for the killing of the male Israelite children? Now, PAPYRUS was not the only place where evidence of such high infant mortality occurred. Now, such evidence is also found at Kahun, the town that we looked at before, near the Middle Kingdom periods. Now, archaeologist Rosalie David wrote the following about this town of Kahun. She writes, "It is apparent that the Asiatics were present in the town in some numbers, and this may have reflected the situation elsewhere in Egypt. Their exact homeland in Syria or Palestine cannot be determined. The reason for their presence remains unclear. Now, Petrie discovered wooden boxes underneath the floors of many of the houses at Kahun. They contained babies, sometimes buried 2 or 3 to a box and aged only a few months at death." This is consistent, of course, with the Pharaoh's decree. And she goes on to say that the quantity, range and type of articles of everyday use which were left behind in the houses may indeed suggest that the departure was sudden and unpremeditated. End quote. Now, the evidence of this sudden departure of slaves from a walled town of slaves begs the question: how can slaves just all suddenly get up and walk out of Egypt? Now, another piece of evidence that lends support to Israel's former presence in the nation of Egypt at this time is the Brooklyn Papyrus. Now, the Brooklyn Papyrus records a slave list with names that seem to come straight off the pages of the Bible, such as Asher, Issachar, Menahem, and Shifra, the midwife that we looked at before. Now, also of note in this papyrus is that there was also a disproportionately high number of females in this slave list. Now, before I used a total of 9 generations to calculate the number of Israelites at the time of the Exodus, yet in Genesis 15:16, God told Abraham that they would come out in the 4th generation. Now, a generation in this verse could refer to 10 years, a typical lifetime, or it could possibly refer to the special case of the family of Moses and Aaron, where due to the lateness of having children, there are only 4 generations. Now that covers the historical background and the events leading up to the birth of Moses. So on that note, we'll conclude part 1, and I'll begin to cover the life of Moses proper in the next part of Lessons from Moses